Welcome to the Partardez channel. Today we explain Prophets Kings 2, chapter 13 in a clear and simple way, step by step. We're going to take our time and walk right through the text of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, carefully exploring some profound historical shifts, astonishing miracles, and really deep lessons about human action and divine grace. We'll make absolutely sure you understand exactly who is doing what, where these events take place, and why they matter so much to the broader story. To really appreciate this chapter, we need to start with a central, burning question. Just think about this for a second. What actually happens when a nation's absolute greatest prophet is literally on his deathbed? For decades now, spanning the reigns of multiple kings, the northern kingdom of Israel has relied heavily on the miraculous interventions and the spiritual guidance of the great prophet Elisha. He's been their anchor. But now, that anchor is slipping away. I want you to keep this dramatic reality in the back of your mind as we go through this, because the fading away of a spiritual giant leaves a massive void, and the fate of an entire nation is suddenly hanging in the balance. All right, let's set the stage and get our historical context straight. At this point in history, God's people are split into two completely separate kingdoms, Judah down in the south and Israel up in the north. This chapter focuses entirely on that northern kingdom of Israel, which has its capital in the city of Samaria. And, well, things are not going great. Israel is currently suffering under the intense, absolutely crushing military oppression of a neighboring kingdom called Aram, which we'd know today as modern-day Syria. In ancient Near Eastern warfare, this didn't just mean losing a battle or two, right? Systematically dismantling a nation meant burning the crops, destroying the livestock, cutting off vital trade routes, and laying these brutal, starving sieges to walled cities. It was total existential devastation, making daily life incredibly dangerous and difficult for the Israelites. Here is the roadmap for our explainer today. 1. The Reign of Jehoahaz. 2. King Jehoash takes the throne. 3. Elijah's final prophetic act. 4. A miracle in the tomb. 5. God's mercy and victory. And finally, 6. Key lessons and our chapter recap. Let's jump right into section 1. The Reign of Jehoahaz. Oppression and mercy. The chapter kicks off in verse 1 by telling us that in the 23rd year of Joash, the king of Judah, a man named Jehoahaz, the son of Jehu, becomes the king of Israel in Samaria, and he rules for 17 years. Immediately in verses 2 and 3, we get a flat-out evaluation of his character. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord. The text emphasizes that he followed the sins of Jeroboam. Now, to understand that, we got to look back. Jeroboam was a previous king who set up golden calves at Dan and Bethel to physically and politically stop the people from traveling south to worship at the temple in Jerusalem. It started as a political border control tactic, but it became a catastrophic spiritual disaster. Because Jehoahaz perpetuated this deep-rooted idolatry and just refused to turn away, God's anger burned against Israel. As a direct consequence, God kept them under the oppressive, heavy power of Hazael, the king of Aram, and later under Hazael's son, Ben-Hadad. But then we hit verses 4 and 5, and we see this stunning contrast. Despite his evil ways, despite the idolatry, King Jehoahaz gets desperate. The oppression from the king of Aram is so severe that Jehoahaz actually turns and seeks the Lord's favor. And, incredibly, the text tells us the Lord listened to him. In the Hebrew text, God seeing or listening implies taking active notice to actually intervene. God saw how brutally the king of Aram was crushing Israel, so the Lord provided a deliverer for Israel, allowing them to finally escape from the grip of the Arameans. Now, the text interestingly leaves this deliverer unnamed. Some scholars suggest it was Elisha's influence, while others point to the rising power of Assyria that ended up distracting Aram's armies. Regardless of who the instrument was, the result was exactly what they needed. The Israelites were finally able to live peacefully in their own homes again. However, verse 6 sadly notes that even after this amazing divine rescue, they still didn't abandon the sins of Jeroboam. In fact, an Asherah pole, a pagan idol, just remained standing right there in the capital of Samaria. To truly grasp just how desperate their situation had become before God delivered them, you've got to look at the shocking military statistics in verse 7. The army of Jehoahaz had been utterly decimated. The king of Aram had destroyed the Israelite forces, leaving them with only 50 horsemen, 10 chariots, and 10,000 foot soldiers. To put that into perspective for you, for a national army of that era, 10 chariots is practically nothing. It is a completely defenseless posture. The text uses this powerful, incredibly violent image to explain this, stating the Arameans had made Israel's army like the dust at threshing time. Threshing is the agricultural process of beating grain repeatedly until it shatters, separating the wheat from the chaff. Israel's army had literally been pulverized into dust, completely crushed, scattered, and entirely powerless to defend themselves without God stepping in. Moving on to Section 2, King Jehoash takes the throne, a new reign. In verses 8 through 10, King Jehoahaz passes away, he rests with his fathers, and is buried in Samaria. Stepping up to take the throne next is his son, Jehoash. Looking at the timeline here really helps us keep all these similar-sounding names straight. We just finished with Jehoahaz, who ruled for 17 years. Now his son Jehoash, who, by the way, is sometimes referred to as Joash in the text, begins a 16-year reign in Samaria. Verses 11 and 12 tell us the tragic reality that just like his father, the new King Jehoash also did evil in the eyes of the Lord and clung tightly to the sins of the original Jeroboam. It's this frustrating, repetitive cycle of spiritual failure. Looking ahead to verse 13, when Jehoash eventually dies, he'll be succeeded by his own son, who is actually named Jeroboam, directly linking that legacy of sin straight across the generations. Section 3. Elisha's final prophetic act, the arrow of victory. We now reach a deeply personal, highly emotional narrative, starting right in verse 14. The great prophet Elisha, the man who parted the Jordan River, the guy who healed Naaman of leprosy and performed countless other miracles, is now in his deathbed, suffering from a terminal illness. King Jehoash, despite his severe moral failings, understands the sheer gravity of this moment. He goes down to visit the dying prophet, and he actually weeps over him. The king cries out, my father, the chariots and horsemen of Israel." This is a profound, incredibly telling statement. By calling Elisha the chariots and horsemen of Israel, the king is openly admitting that the prophet's spiritual connection to God was the true defense of the nation. It was their ultimate iron dome, so to speak. Elisha was worth far more than an entire physical army. The king is weeping because he is absolutely terrified of losing his nation's protector. So the crucial point here is how Elisha responds to the weeping king. Even weak and dying, the prophet totally takes charge. In verses 15 through 17, Elisha gives the king a strange but extremely specific set of instructions. Step 1. He tells the king to get a bow and some arrows, and to take the bow in his hands. Then, Elisha physically places his own frail hands right over the king's hands, a beautiful, literal image of divine authority backing up human action. Step 2. He says, open the east window. This is deeply significant geographically. The east, specifically the northeast, toward Damascus, is the exact direction of Aram, their great enemy. Elisha is having the king literally point his weapon toward the threat. Step 3. He simply commands, shoot, and the king fires the arrow right out the open window. As that arrow cuts through the air toward the east, Elisha makes a dramatic, powerful prophetic declaration. He shouts, "The Lord's arrow of victory, the arrow of victory over Aram, you will completely destroy the Arameans at Apek." That single soaring arrow wasn't just a piece of wood flying out a window, it was a physical manifestation of God's promise. Apek was a well-known historical battleground, this wide plain where ancient chariots could effectively maneuver, making it a highly strategic location for a definitive military clash. Elisha is standing there, promising a total upcoming victory at this specific site. But you see, the prophetic instruction isn't quite over yet. We move to verse 18. Elisha tells King Jehoash to take the remaining bundle of arrows. The prophet then gives a simple command: strike the ground. Now think about this. The king has just been told these very arrows represent total, absolute victory over his worst enemy. But how does he react? He takes the arrows, he strikes the ground 3 times, and then he just stops. There's just silence. He doesn't show passion, he doesn't show relentless drive or faith, he just gives 3 token, weak taps against the floor and calls it quits. Let's pause for a second to explain exactly why Elisha is having him do all this, drawing on the simple, literal insights of the great medieval scholar Nahmanides. Nahmanides explains that these instructions were not just games, they weren't theater, or just metaphors. They were a symbolic act of prophecy. In biblical times, a prophet would use a physical action, like shooting an arrow or striking the ground, to take a divine decree and firmly, securely anchor it into the physical world. The physical action turned the spiritual promise into an actual, irreversible reality. By acting it out, the prophecy was mathematically guaranteed to be fulfilled based strictly on the action taken. Because the physical act dictates the future reality, Elisha is absolutely furious with the king's half-hearted effort. In verse 19, the man of God becomes intensely angry and reprimands Jehoash, saying, "You should have struck the ground 5 or 6 times. Then you would have defeated Aram and completely destroyed it. but now you will defeat it only 3 times. The king's lack of zeal, his glaring lack of faith and enthusiasm in simply striking the ground, literally limited his own future success. Because he only struck the ground 3 times, God's victory over Aram would be capped at exactly 3 defeats. Aram would survive to fight another day, all because the king held back. Section 4. A miracle in the tomb, life after death. In verses 20 and 21, the text briefly notes that Elisha dies and is buried. Sometime later, a terrifying reality of the era is mentioned. Bands of Moabite raiders would cross the borders into Israel every single spring, just terrorizing the countryside. Spring was harvest time, making it the perfect opportunity for enemies to sweep in and steal food and resources. One day, a group of Israelites are out in the open, right in the middle of burying a man. Suddenly, they spot a band of these dangerous Moabite raiders approaching. In a complete panic to escape, they abandon their plans for a proper burial and hastily throw the dead body into the nearest open cave, which just so happens to be the tomb of Elisha. The text describes a startling, sudden miracle. The very moment the dead body touches the dry bones of the prophet Elisha, the man instantly comes back to life and stands right up on his feet. This amazing, vivid detail shows Israel that God's intensely holy, life-giving power rested so heavily on Elisha that it lingered even after his death. God's power was still very much present in their land. Section 5. God's mercy and Israel's victory, the promise kept. Verse 22 reminds us of the harsh reality that Hazael, the king of Aram, oppressed Israel throughout the entire reign of Jehoahaz. This raises a very serious theological question, doesn't it? Considering how evil the kings of Israel were and how deeply the nation sinned, why didn't God just let Aram wipe them out completely? Well, verse 23 provides the simple, profound truth. It says that the Lord was gracious to them, had compassion, and showed concern for them. Why? Not because Israel had earned it through good behavior, but specifically because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God remembered the unbreakable promises he made centuries earlier to the patriarchs of the Jewish people. The text states clearly that to this day, God was unwilling to destroy them or banish them from his presence solely because of that ancient loving commitment. It is a pure, beautiful demonstration of unearned grace. And God's word is precise. Verses 24 and 25 wrap up the historical narrative by showing the exact, literal fulfillment of Elisha's deathbed prophecy. Hazael, the king of Aram, finally dies, and his son Ben-Hadad succeeds him on the throne. King Jehoash of Israel then goes to war to recapture the Israelite towns that had been taken by Aram during those previous years of oppression. And exactly how many times does Jehoash defeat Ben-Hadad in battle? Exactly 3 times. Just as the king weakly struck the ground only 3 times, he achieved exactly 3 military victories, recovering the towns of Israel, but totally failing to destroy Aram completely. History perfectly matched the prophetic action. Section 6. Key lessons and chapter recap. What we take away. So we've gone step by step through the text, seeing a cycle of oppression, a weeping king, the actual mechanics of prophecy, and a stunning resurrection. But what do we actually take away from this ancient history? First, we saw God responding to the desperate prayer of a seriously flawed king, and we saw God sparing Israel entirely because of his ancient covenant. The practical lesson here is all about unearned grace. God's mercy and loving kindness are so often based on his own faithfulness and promises, not on our perfection. Second, there's that profound lesson of King Jehoash striking the ground with the arrows. The undeniable lesson there is that our actions and our zeal deeply matter. The king's half-hearted effort literally limited his own future success. We are active partners in bringing about the good in our own lives.
So I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to chew on. Think about the areas in your own life where you are seeking a breakthrough, a victory, or a positive change. Are you just tapping the ground lightly, maybe holding back your energy, your faith, and your commitment? Or are you striking the ground with all your might, showing full zeal? Don't ever let a lack of passion limit your potential. Thank you for learning with us. If this helped you understand the chapter better, like, subscribe, and join us to the next chapter.